So how many of you have built a REST API? How many of you did the documentation a little bit late and had your QA people come up to you and say, hey, where's the documentation? And how many of you have had to go through the trouble of taking in that JSON data and then custom writing the validation and doing all this other stuff? It's a pain, right? I hate doing that stuff. And so my motivation for figuring this out is because at Comcast we build a lot of REST APIs, and this is one of those things that I don't want to have to do over and over again. So it's great to see that there's all the Go generation of code and all those other things. This will help you get further along in actually defining your APIs, documenting them, and validating them very easily in code. So there's three pieces. JSON schema, which is a way to actually take a JSON object and define it to say what properties it has, which ones are required, any validation, any patterns of the string that might be in there. Additionally, there's RAML and Swagger, which is very similar, which allows you to take a REST API and define it. So you can programmatically and write code to actually parse it out and do a whole bunch of things. And the final part is a little tool called RAML to HTML, which uses the RAML and can generate all your documentation for you. So let's see. JSON schema, a little bit about JSON schema. I could show you over here is what it looks like. You can see some of the properties that are defined. You can see at the bottom the ones that are required. We've got some other stuff. RAML, here's a look at what RAML looks like. You can see that in this case there's songs that's defined. You can specify the responses, the body, and there again you see how the JSON schema is integrated into the RAML. And there's a whole bunch of projects that can take this RAML data and do a lot of things with it. There's a designer that as you're writing the RAML, you can see the documentation and you can actually see all the puts and posts and things like that. There's other tools that you can actually, and hopefully Go will get there and we can do some integration into GoKit, for instance, and we can actually generate the server-side code so you don't have to deal with all the onion layers. You run it, you're done, then you can actually focus on the problem. In addition, you can generate a lot of client stuff. I was actually able to define an API in RAML, and then within an hour, I built a full Angular front end that could actually do full CRUD operations using the client code that was generated from RAML. All right, so let's change my display settings possibly. So let's look at some of how this is done. Here's some RAML, and it's a simple definition for adding some keys. And you can see in here, we've got a body, the body that's going to come in. I'm going to define in this key value post body JSON. So over here, here's an example. It just takes in a value. You can define it as string. You can define it as being required. And now going over to some of the Go code. So this example is actually using GoCraft. So you can see here the general design. Let me pop over here. Is when you build your REST API, not only do you deliver the REST API functions, but you're also embedding the documentation and the schema along with it. And then the additional trick is that in your API code, you will locally reference that schema file. So now you can present schemas to the outside world. You can use the schemas internally to do the validation. So let's pop over to the validation. So in this case, we've got create key value, and I'm using a library, JSON schema. In this example, the request comes in, I have my schema file, I'm just have a simple validation function that many things can use. Here's sort of the hacky, because I did it this morning. But this gives you the idea of the request comes in, you take the body, you decode it, and then using the JSON schema library, you can just parse it and validate it right there. So it will deal with the requirements, the required variables, and all sorts of stuff so that you don't actually have to code it up every single time. So for a demo, well, here's my documentation, not found, but that's okay because I can generate it once I find my prompt. Well, I'll get back to that in a moment, but here's the schema that's delivered. You can hit the API and you can see the schema. Here's the schema file for the value. Here's an example of me posting data. And I'm not presenting back real JSON, but hacky view. So not real JSON. I can type in some blah here. Not valid. I can put something that is valid JSON. And you can see that it says the value property is missing because in that JSON schema, it was actually required. And then if I go back up and I put in and I post this, then you can see that it's successful. So this is all in Go code. It makes it really easy to define your schemas, present it as documentation, and consume it internally to do all the validation, so you don't have to do all that legwork. And so for reference, here's some other things. And try out the RAML to HTML. It actually produces some nice documentation for people to look at.